Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of TCG Talk, back today with another video. And in today's video, I wanted to talk about what I think is the most underrated deck that's not being talked about in Flesh and Blood right now, Riptide. I think Riptide's a very good hero right now. I think it's a near meta hero in my opinion, and some people may disagree with that. That's totally fine. But I think the hero has some really good matchups right now, especially into all three of the new Misfell heroes, which I think we're going to see a lot of representation from at Nationals, as well as just like coming events in general. I want to talk about some of the matchups. Now, some of these matchups you may not agree with, and that's totally fine. I'm sure like people who main these heroes will have strong opinions. Flesh and Blood is full of 90-90 matchups, but we're going to talk about it, have some fun with it, and get your feedback as well. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you're a long-standing supporter, thank you so much as always. Feel free to check out the Discord, all that good stuff down below. We'll get right into it. So yeah, if I put your hero in a place that you don't agree with, that's fine. Please let me know down in the comments. Everyone has different opinions. Like a perfect one is the Vincent new matchup. I think the Vincent is very favored. I've had no trouble with Vincent, but I also have Vincents that tell me that it just like it's really good for them. So it all depends, right? And that's totally fine. But Riptide as a hero, I think is a hero that's been slowly creeping up for like the last two formats. And I think it's a hero that no one wants to admit is pretty good right now. And yeah, I think a lot of top players don't want to admit that this deck is just good now. It's gotten a lot of tools. It's getting even more stuff, and it just naturally does good into a lot of the meta decks in the format right now. And I kind of wanted to talk about it, right? I think it's a hero that you could legitimately take to Nationals with a serious mindset of like, I think this is a deck to play where I could get a top 8. We saw a couple top 8s at the very end of the season last season with I know there was a big stream match against Pablo Pintor where Pablo ended up falling to Riptide. There was a top 8 at Ballhard and top 8 at a couple big ProQuests, and then he also got a couple wins as well. So he's gotten more and more notoriety as time has gone on. But I think, first off, before we get into this little tier list thing here, when it talks about all three Misfell heroes, I guess we'll go over them first, and then we'll talk about the tier list. So really quick, the tier list, heavily favored means like, if I had to give an arbitrary number, above 55%, right? I don't mean like 70-30. That's not what I'm saying when they're in that tier. I mean like, you know, if they played 10 times, I think the Riptide wins 6 of those, maybe 7, but it's like in between 55-65, right? Riptide doesn't have any like 70-30, 80-20 matchups. He has a lot of matchups. I think he's in like that 60 percentile range, like 58 to 62, if you're giving like super specific percentages. But that's what heavy favored means. Slightly favored means just over 50%, right? In between that 50-55 mark is my guess, right? I'm not using exact percentages when I go over this. I'm just trying to give you an example. 50-50 is what it sounds like. Slightly unfavored, same way, except different. Where it's 45 to 50%, he's slightly unfavored too, and then heavily unfavored is, you know, he's a little bit struggle bus in that matchup. And so when it comes to the Misfell heroes, really quick before we get into everyone, I think he's very favored into 2 of the heroes, and then he's slightly favored into 1. I think he's very favored into New and Enigma. Right now, the best version of Riptide, in my opinion, from a competitive perspective, is the aggro variant that has a mid-range package. Talon and his team have it. Go look at their channel, New Horizons. If I remember to do it, I will link it down in the description. I'll tag their channel. Please go check them out. They're starting to put out videos. But yeah, the aggro variant, I would call it aggro, with a mid-range package, and that basically means like they're not running any major traps in the main board except for the legendary traps. And then they side in packages of traps that they need depending on the matchup. So they have inertia trap in there, tar pit, frailty trap, stuff like that, right? A couple boulder traps, maybe in a pendulum trap if you prefer that. But because of that, it does really well into Enigma because it can apply the pressure it needs to apply with its aggro variant, with wing shot, and with, you know, blood rot tokens and all sort of stuff. And you can even tech into that matchup very well. But it also has traps that will ping damage onto Enigma and force her ward to pop potentially. So really, really good for that matchup. If you're running more of a mid-range to fatigue style Riptide, then that matchup definitely isn't in the heavily favored category. But if you're running the variant that I think is the most consistent right now, I think it's very good for that. Then we have New. New is just really good for Riptide. Lots of traps, lots of defense reactions, is able to play around New's ability very, very well because you pretty much can block pretty efficiently and nothing gets banished. And when it does get banished, can't really use any of it. Riptide's able to like play around her pretty well, and he also can run Dreadbore, which allows him to get around her defense reactions a little bit better and makes her play a little bit more straight up. So Assassin's never had a great time with a talented Riptide player. New is no exception. And then we have Zen. I put Zen in the slightly favored category because I do think Riptide is favored, but Zen can just hit the win button. And if Zen draws his nuts hand when Riptide doesn't have any traps, it can feel a little bit bad. Plus, Zen doesn't rely as much on hits, so stuff like Tarpit Trap doesn't really matter unless you play it, unless you get lucky and you Tarpit like, you know, a Flex Claws or something like that, or you Tarpit a attack before they play like Biting Breeze. It can be a little bit useful, but it's that prevent on hit ability isn't as crazy, but it's still slightly favored. So all three of the new heroes, which you're going to see a lot of representation in, I think Riptide's very favored into. Now let's go into the tier list in general. Let's go across the heavily favored board. Arachne, no discussion there. It's just kind of better into, but it's not really a meta hero, so we won't spend a lot of time on it. Katsu's very similar to Zen, where using Tarpit Trap, Frailty Trap, all that stuff's very good. The reason that Riptide's even more favored in a Katsu as he is in the Zen is because those Tarpit Traps do matter. If Katsu plays a Kodachi and you Tarpit Trap that Kodachi, its Katsu trigger's turned off that turn, because since Katsu trigger's the first time something hits, and Tarpit Trap says the next time an attack action card hits, if it defends an attack would go again, on hit effects don't trigger. So Katsu trigger just is turned off for that entire turn. Insanely good into him. He likes to lead with Kodachis or use Kodachis, which Frailty Trap is amazing into. Inertia Trap's very good into as well because he's buffing stuff with Ancestral Empowerment and Art of War. Just really good in general. Dash, I found this variant to be this matchup to be pretty straightforward. It's not like it's like free or anything. It's just pretty favored because you just run Dreadbore. That way they can't, just in case they run like Slab Dash into you. So it helps prevent those defense reactions. And Dash just really can't block you out super well. She doesn't run a lot of defense reactions unless it's the Slab variant. And if you're running Dreadbore anyway, that kind of equalizes it. And you're able to do with Frailty tokens, with Frailty Trap, and with Codex of Frailty itself, being able to play stuff like Remorseless, stuff, all these like different attacks that just really can hurt Dash. I think it's a pretty straightforward matchup. Now, these next two are going to be the ones I think people are going to disagree with the most, and that's completely fine. I think Warrior's pretty heavily favored for Riptide. I think Warrior has to two-handed Warrior, or one-handed Warriors, for example, like Axes and Sabers. I think that matchup is very difficult for them. They have to play a very unique way that is not in their normal play pattern, which makes their deck naturally less efficient. And you're able to just push damage. Running Dreadbore into them is just really good as well. They can't be as defensive as they want to be and really outvalue you. There is a way you can get decked in a Warrior, and I think that's kind of the skill gap. I'm not saying like I'm like this amazing Riptide player, but I finally learned this matchup enough to where like 6 months ago, I probably would have put both Warriors in 50-50 to slightly favored. And now the more I know the matchup, the more heavy favored it is. I wouldn't say it's like 70-30. Again, it's like maybe like 58 to 60% win rate if I had to give an arbitrary number. But I think it's very, very good for Riptide and so on and so forth. Then we have Enigma. We already talked about. New. We already talked about. Fi. I mean, unless they just high roll you, it's very good. Giving them Frailty tokens, being able to disrupt their hand, stuff like that, just really, really good. Then we move into slightly favorite category. Olympia I haven't had a ton of reps into as a Riptide, but it works very similar to the traditional Warriors. The two Warriors that can give Riptide trouble, depending on how he draws, is Decimator Olympia, which is why he's in slightly favored. It can give him a little bit of issues because his defense reactions just aren't as good. But then Dreadbore kind of balances that matchup out, but it's still a little difficult. And then Dawnblade Dory. That's one thing I didn't talk about in the heavily favored. If it's a Dawnblade Dory, I think I put it down slightly favored. But Decimator and Dawnblade can give Riptide a little bit more of an issue. Levia is very good, and I want to see how the matchup feels with Shadow Realm Horror. I know, but prior to Shadow Realm Horror, it felt pretty good. You're able to like utilize your Frailty Traps very well on their claws on Blood Rush turns, and Inertia Trap. Boulder Trap's very good to them because they do buff their stuff sometimes. So overall, the matchup's feels pretty good. You're very defensive. You're very able to block out efficiently. If Levia does her stupid thing, she does her stupid thing, right? But typically, I think you're pretty favored in that matchup. Slightly favored. Dio slightly favored. Frailty Traps just absolutely, like Frailty tokens in general, just absolutely destroy this hero. It sucks for them. Tarpit Trap's very good as well because it will affect Boom Grenade. On hit effects don't trigger, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure it does that, yeah. Inertia Trap can be useful if they're using like BIOS update or something like that, but typically you're able to just block them efficiently, disrupt their hand, do all that type of stuff, and win pretty easy. Bolton feels pretty good again, and Uziri. Again, Assassin in general just feels pretty good for Riptide, but Bolton, he's attack reacting all the time. So stuff like Pendulum Trap, Boulder Trap, very, very good into him. He's not able to buff his attacks as much because you're not blocking with a lot of attack action cards or action cards in general. So really, really good for that. The 50-50 is Azalea. This matchup's so interesting. If Azalea runs Death Dealer, I think it's favored for Riptide. Slightly favored. If she's smart and she runs Dreadbore, which I think most Azaleas are actually on now in the side, then it immediately becomes Azalea favored. So it's kind of a skill matchup. It's not like super swingy, like it goes from 60-40 to 60-40. It's just like teeters like this, basically. But I put it in the 50-50 because it all depends on how Azalea approaches the matchup. Then we move into the slightly unfavored stuff. So Arcane in general is not good for Riptide. Vincent and Viscerai feel bad. Kano feels bad. KO, since he got Sash, is a lot worse. It's definitely not like super unfavored. It's just you have to really block efficiently and hope that they don't high roll, because your traps do trigger, but they don't disrupt, right? So unless you get lucky and like, you can trap out a Wild Ride and then, stop their CNC on hit. Like that's really the only time that there's like the actual abilities on those cards matter. So it's a little bit slightly unfavored, but it's definitely winnable for sure. Prism is the one weird one. Prism, I'd say, is like 40-60. It's really interesting. That matchup is very swingy. If they can't find an on hit and you're able to use your traps effectively, because it's really weird for Prism, she has to play very differently, right? If a card hits, let's say like a turn cycle goes through and something hit and they awakened a Figment, they can't really lead with a Figment ever, because if they do and I trap it and they have no way of preventing that damage, which like if they don't have another Spectral Shield out, then their turn just ends. And then if they lead with a Herald, that's fine, but if I trap it, now their Figment just died. You know what I mean? So it's really interesting. Like they can't really 100% play around it, but they also, what I've noticed with Prisms is they like to get Erudition out or something like that, and then they just lead with Erudition, the Figment of Erudition, draw 2 cards, and just go off to the races. They can't do that against Riptide, at least not as easily. You're taking a risk, right? So it can be a little bit interesting. Sometimes, depending on how your traps line up, it can be hard for them to hold a Figment on board. But if they get like a Genesis or something, or a Spectra plan with Vestige, and they can really just like overvalue you and really overwhelm you because you can't clear it effectively, it can get really bad. And if they ALS, then you're in really big trouble. So it's a swingy matchup for sure. Reinhardt used to be really unfavored. I don't know. I just felt better into the matchup. It's still unfavored a little bit because Intimidate's a thing, and sometimes they'll just intimidate away your traps and there's nothing you can do about it. So it's typically is unfavored. Same thing with Teklo. Like if you can't kill them fast enough before they get their equipment out, then it's really hard to outvalue them at that point. You can very well like boulder trap their equipment and stuff like that and make it a little bit more favorable, but it's very difficult. Same thing with Max. He's just trying to slow you down until he gets to his form. Overpower isn't as useful against you, but it for some reason that matchup is bad. I don't know why. And then Guardians, all the Guardians are heavily unfavored for sure. But looking at this, if you can tell, looking at this this list, the meta decks right now that Riptide is bad into are Prism is the worst one, right? Kano, I guess, right? It's technically a meta deck. And then KO. KO is still not even that bad. It's really close to 50-50. I would say if I had to give an arbitrary number, KO is like 46% in the KO or something like that, 47. It's not that big a deal. Prism and Kano are the two biggest meta matchups that Riptide has issues with. But if you look at the other stuff that he doesn't have issues with, he's very good in aggro, very good in ninja, good into warrior, good into assassin, good in like stuff like Leviah. Like he has a lot of game into a lot of the perceived meta decks, I think, going into nationals. And I think he could actually be really good. And a skilled Riptide can definitely get around some of these bad matchups. Like the good thing about Riptide is he doesn't. A lot of the decks right now have very polarizing matchups, right? Like Enigma, although can win, doesn't typically like aggro like KO and Ninja, and is typically not great into those matchups. You really have to have an uphill battle. Assassin's good into some stuff, but is also terrible into Enigma. Ninja is good into a lot of stuff, but is also kind of bad in Assassin. Like they all have like these polarizing counter matchups, whereas Riptide's counter matchup is Guardian, and there might be a couple victors running around at Nats. I definitely think he'll be represented, but typically, like, he doesn't have a counter deck that is in the top of the meta. I guess Prism would be the closest one, and because of that, I think he's really good because he's very skill intensive. If you can learn the hero and play it really well, I think you could do really good even at a tier 3 event. It's really funny that it would not confuse me if someone brought a Riptide to a tier 3 event. Just wouldn't. Some people might disagree with that. I think a lot of good players are hive minding. They don't want to admit that this hero is good. Like, I've seen several players I won't mention that are very high up. They're like, bad people will play this deck, or they're just playing it for passion. But I just disagree. I think the hero is very good. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear it. I just wanted to bring this up because I truly do think Riptide is like the most underrated hero in the game right now. There's a couple other ones, and I want to do a list on like the most underrated heroes going into nationals. I'll do that probably tomorrow, but Riptide's definitely gonna be on that list. Surprise, surprise. With a couple others. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear them. If you like this type of content, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe. If not me, it's totally fine. Go to another creator, leave a like, comment, subscribe on their stuff so we can get more people seeing this game. And I'll see y'all next time on TCG Talk. Thank y'all so much.